let's take a look together at some things about constraints, some operations that I personally find really convenient and useful. So let's look here. I've made a parent constraint between these two models. It's the exact same behavior as what we've talked about before. Now, if we select this driven object, first, just like we mentioned, we'll see in its channel box that some of the attributes have turned into this light blue color. This just means it's being constrained by an object. We'll also notice that under shapes, we got something new here called parent constraint. So if an object has a constraint on it, it will usually show up under here by default. Here we can see information about this constraint. In our scenes example, it's a parent constraint. And we see some of its attributes. We don't need to worry about these attributes for now. But there's one thing I'd like us to pay close attention to, and that's this last attribute for the weight. This weight attribute, it doesn't just show us its weight value. If we also read the name in front of it, right before the W0, we'll see this thing called driver mesh. This matches the name of our driver object. So when we select our driven object and find its corresponding constraint node, we can actually see which object is the driver just by looking at this weight attribute. We don't have to do what we might talk about later, like opening the node editor and then checking its attribute connections. Before we get into more complex operations, a lot of the information we can actually get from this constraint node itself, and I personally find this very convenient. Later on, when we're doing more complex rigging, say in your scene you have hundreds or thousands of nodes, when you select this driven object and you see this constraint node, you can directly find that driver object and find the connection between them. Another thing I find just as convenient, so we know that our constraint nodes are by default placed under our driven object as its child. So if we select our driven object, when we talked about parent relationships before, we mentioned it, the up, down, left, and right arrow keys can be used in our outliner to find the corresponding child objects and objects at the same level. So here we select the driven object, press the down arrow key. Now here, the first thing we select is our shape node. And we know the shape node is also a child of the transform node. If we turn on shapes, we can see it here. When we press the right arrow key again, we'll select the corresponding constraint node. So at this point, if we want to edit this constraint node, like say delete it, we can just conveniently press delete to get rid of it. Now if we look at the driven object again, we can see that node is gone from under shapes. I find this operation really convenient because look, I select this object and then I just need to use the up, down, and left, right keys, and I can select my constraint node right in my scene. We don't have to go into the outliner and search for it. When our scenes get more complicated, sometimes our outliner will also have a lot more nodes, and sometimes it's not that easy to find things. So this operation, in my opinion, is pretty convenient and important. So those two things are what I personally find to be the most common operations when working with constraints. One is finding the driver object's name by looking at our constraint node's weight attribute. The other is using our keyboard's arrow keys to quickly find the corresponding constraint node